Hi everyone, I'm Janet Zhang, a certified college admissions counselor based in San Francisco, South Bay. Today's topic is on SAT essay, which could be challenging to many high school students. I'm very happy that we'll be spending the next hour together to discuss SAT essay with Niles. Niles is a certified SAT rater by CollegeBoard and a true expert on SAT, ACT prep. Yes, he's one of the SAT raters who read and grade your SAT essay. Students need to know what graders are looking for. Niles has been doing SAT, ACT prep and English teaching for almost 10 years and have helped many students improve their SAT scores. The session is about 60 minutes, including 10 to 15 minutes questions and answers at the end. I hope all the students have had a chance to read the article by Paul Bogart, Let There Be Dark. Now let's welcome Niles.
Hello everyone, it's nice to meet you. I'm Niles, and I'm going to explain a little bit about the test, and I'm going to use the essay "Let There Be Dark" as an example to discuss that. First of all, I'm going to lay out what needs to be done on the essay. There are two graders, and each grader will score the student on 3 different areas. That means that the highest possible score would be 24. The first grading area is the reading grading area. And to put it simply, the student is being graded on how well they understand the main idea of the passage, that they understand exactly what is being said, and they don't get anything wrong. If they don't get anything wrong, they'll get a 3 minimum and a 4 maximum. The second grading category is analysis, which is a discussion of a grading on how the student analyzes what the author is saying, which is kind of difficult to put in any more simple terms. But what students need to do is pick out the main ideas of each part of the passage and then find the details and the methods that the author uses to make his points. Then the final thing the student needs to do is the writing. The final grading point is writing, which analyzes word choice and organization and sentence complexity. And so it doesn't have to be without error, but it needs to be consistent, and there needs to not be any distracting mistakes. The biggest issue that students often have is if they don't have any experience with what is expected of them on the SAT before they start. And this is fairly easy, to have no idea about what the SAT is looking for. If you ask someone to look at a newspaper article and analyze the argument that the author is making, you might do something that makes a lot of sense, but it's not what the SAT graders would necessarily be looking for. Once students have some exposure and they have some ability to recognize the way that the SAT is grading and the way that they should look at these essays, it's fairly regularly consistent that students are able to get a minimum score that is acceptable for them. Getting a regular perfect score is much more difficult because there's no way to guarantee the student's ability to identify one particular point in a particular passage. There's also a wide variety of possible passages that could be read, and it may not be one that has been a style that has been released yet. However, I find that most students eventually, even students with low level of perhaps English ability or who haven't had a great deal of success in writing previously, once they know that there is a specific way to write these things that is correct, and there's not much variation from the difference of what constitutes a correct essay. They are glad that there's that correct version, and they're able to follow the rules fairly successfully. The biggest problem that most students have when they get started is that they try to summarize the passage. And while you do need to show your comprehension of the passage, summarizing it is the least effective way to do that. For example, if I was to summarize the Paul Bogart essay about the need for darkness, it would be the author thinks that darkness is important for people and that it is necessary for the environment and for people to have darkness. But the SAT graders know that. They know that it's necessary, that's what it means. And if you just wrote that the author makes these points, you're not fulfilling the requirement of the essay, which is to analyze how the author makes the claims. So the difference between someone getting, say, a 12 and someone getting a 20, someone writing a 12 would just say, this is what the main idea of the passage is. And someone getting a 20 would say, the author does this, he does this, and he does this in order to convince the reader about this. Now, the methods that the author uses, fortunately, it's easy to find a way to think about them, and the way that I usually start out my classes is a discussion of argumentation. Exactly how does someone who is trying to convince you of something try to convince you of those things? Every SAT essay is going to have a point that it is trying to convince the reader of, or the listener if it's a transcript of a speech. So going back to ancient Greek times, it's an idea that maybe a lot of students already are familiar with because of composition classes or debate classes and so on and so on. But if they're not, then it's good to learn about it. And if they already know it, then it's always good to get a refresher about these complicated subjects. And so the first thing we talk about in my classes is the difference between logos, ethos, and pathos. And some students might roll their eyes because they've heard it a million times before, and some students have never heard anything about it before. But it's very, very important to realize that these things exist and to get a sense of what's happening in a passage as you read it, while you read it. And to be able to know, the author is using ethos here, or he's using logos here, or he's using pathos here. However, one thing that I have seen a lot of is that a lot of students get confused. They hear this from instructors, or they hear this from books, or they read this on websites, and they get conflicting reports from people who are trying to help them about exactly how do you use this knowledge of logos, ethos, and pathos. It would be possible to write an essay that consists of an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, one body paragraph about logos, 1 body paragraph about ethos, and 1 body paragraph about pathos, and then a conclusion. And you'd have a pretty solid 2-page essay if you were dealing with a passage that contained an argument based on ethos, an argument based on logos, and an argument based on pathos. But before we go on, let me define what each of these things is in case you are not aware of it. I have some of my own terms, some shorthand that I use to describe it, but it's a matter of how the author makes his argument. So, ethos. Ethos is an argument based on tradition or expertise or authority. So one example I give is, why do you do what your parents tell you to do? If you don't want to, do your chores in the house, and your father says, do them, and you say, why? And he says, because I'm your father. That is an ethos-based argument. The number 2 I'll talk about is pathos. That one's a little easier because it's got the path. It's easier to remember because it's path. So it's talking about emotions like empathy or sympathy. But pathos is an appeal to emotion. It's when an author makes a vivid description like, do you remember that feeling that you have when you wake up on a cold winter morning and you step outside for the first time and you feel that the creeping ice on your skin or something of that nature? That's off the top of my head, but it's a vivid description of a physical thing that's happening to somebody. And that's pathos because it's tapping into somebody's emotional center of their brain. It could also be about people they care about as well. And then finally, we have logos, which it seems pretty straightforward, and you would say, well, that's an appeal to logic, which it technically is, but logos is more complex than that. It's a matter of right thinking. So if we're talking about facts and figures and numbers, or we're talking about comparison, like if you say, take your umbrella because it's raining and getting wet is bad, that's not emotional, that's not authority, that's just fact. That's just logical that you don't want to get wet, so you bring an umbrella. That's an argument based on logos. The way I summarize it would be, if an author uses logos, he wants you to think like him. If an author uses pathos, he wants you to feel like him. And if an author uses ethos, he wants you to trust him. Or put another way, think like me, feel like me, and trust me. And incredibly, these three categories are able to encompass pretty much every single possible argument that you will ever run into. Now, they're not clear-cut categories, however. If you think of patriotism, for example, patriotism, if you appeal to somebody's patriotism, do this for your country. You're appealing to their emotions, and you're appealing to the authority of the nation. So patriotism is almost a 50-50 split between pathos and ethos. So these things are not perfect tools. They're not scalpels. They're hammers. And that's what people often fall into the trap of, is like, well, when I try to write this body paragraph and say that the author is using ethos, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense because ethos is such a broad term that it's very hard to write specifically about it. However, if you think specifically about patriotism and you don't call it ethos and you call it patriotism instead, you are going to be dealing with more specific terms, and you can use the specific, you can talk about the specific reference to the passage as well. So it's a lot easier to think about this if we look at an example. So let's go to we'll take a look at the Paul Bogart passage. And at the beginning, in the first two paragraphs, he's got this description of himself as a child. He's at a Minnesota lake in the woods, and he sees the smoky trails, the meteors leaving smoky trails across sugary spreads of stars. I'll let you guess for a second what that's going to be, and I'll mention it in the next one. And that's clearly pathos. He's talking about sugary spreads of stars. You can see the vivid imagery of the hand across the sky, the meteors across the sky. And then he transitions right into, but now when 8 of 10 children born in the United States will never know a sky dark enough, that is an example of what? That's an example of logos. He says 8 out of 10 children born in the United States, that's logos. And then in the third paragraph, he says, already the World Health Organization classifies working the night shift as a human carcinogen, and the AMA has voiced its unanimous support for blah, blah, blah. This is an example of the remaining Greek term, and that's ethos. The ethos is a reference to the World Health Organization and the American Medical Association, their respected institutions. Now, if you are able to analyze these things and you're able to say the author uses vivid imagery to do this, then you're almost all the way there. But what it really needs is practice. You can't just say he uses vivid imagery. The difference between someone who gets an 18 and someone who gets a 24 is how well they describe why the author is doing this. Not just that he is doing this, or she, but why she is using it to make that point. And this is the difficulty that students run into, because you can say that an author uses pathos to appeal to emotion, but if you say that the author is using patriotism to appeal to emotion, or patriotism to make the reader trust them, that's very minor analysis. You are technically doing the analysis, but if you only say that the author is making this appeal to emotion to blah, 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 then it's not enough. You need to be able to say something like, the author appeals to the reader's patriotism in order to convince them that even though it's going to be a difficult task, we all need to work together to get this through. It's a very big difference. And students can get used to it. They can learn how to talk about these things. They may never have thought about it before, but they may be ready to think about it now. And after some practice, it gets pretty easy. So I'll give you an example. So say that an author is making an argument about, say they're making an argument and they compare this situation to an event in history. They go back and say, this is just like when Napoleon came back from Elba. And I'll leave it to you to say, well, first of all, what Greek words is that? And then why would the author be doing that? So I would argue that a historical analogy like the Napoleon one I just made up there would be a combination of logos and ethos. You say, this has happened before, and I know about these things, and this is what happened when that happened. So that's an ethos. That's a certain amount of expertise, credibility. On the other hand, it's also logos, because you're comparing apples to oranges. You're making a comparison and you're saying this has these qualities and that has these qualities, so they are like each other, and it's logical that this would happen if this is happening. So why would an author make an appeal to historical? Why would an author make a historical analogy? Well, we know that he's using ethos and logos, so he wants to seem credible. And he wants to convince the reader of the significance of his claims. He wants to show not how unprecedented it is, that it's not unprecedented that this thing is happening, and that he knows how this is going to turn out. So if we look at the Let There Be Dark passage, why does he mention his childhood experiences in the darkness? Well, by mentioning the childhood experience in the dark, he puts the reader in his position and shows that he has the same feelings as the reader. By doing so, he makes the reader accept his own perspective on the importance of darkness, and he shows the importance of darkness, what they might not have seen before. Throughout the passage, he makes reference to facts and figures that serve to bolster the technical side of his argument. These are not just emotional feelings that he has. There are real scientific and statistical reasons why it's important that the sky stay dark at night, which makes him seem unbiased and makes it seem like a legitimate concern. Finally, he refers to various well-known and well-respected health organizations in order to show that he's not just making up the severity of this threat. So he's established the emotional need for it. He's established the magnitude of it, and then he showed the seriousness of the threat, that the magnitude of the threat is legitimate by referring to the medical associations. By taking it outside of himself, he further shows that he's not biased, and he further shows that this is something that concerns all of us, as the government itself is also concerned. Now, I want to make it clear that these are not the only ways that you can analyze this passage. You could choose to focus on his tone. You could say that he uses a strongly emotional tone throughout to increase the energy and the passion of it, to make the reader feel energetic and passionate. You can come at it from a lot of different directions. The important thing that you need to do is to not be wrong in your analysis, to have actually read it and not be incorrect in the analysis that you make, and then also to do it 3 times, to do it well enough that it shows that you know what you're talking about, you know how to mention these things that are happening, and to be able to write about them. If you can do all 3 of those things, you're going to get a good score on your essay. This seems fairly straightforward. However, there are very many different kinds of passages, and there have been so few tests so far and so little released material compared to what there used to be, that it's very difficult for people to be able to predict exactly what's going to be on the next test. The data set for what to expect from College Board is not that big. So what you need to be able to do is actually analyze a piece of text. There are templates that are out there that will get you half of the way there, but I can pretty much promise anybody who's listening that if you try to memorize a template that's not flexible, and that you have sentences that you use repeatedly, and you are just writing about logos, ethos, and pathos, or you are just repeating particular points that you're looking for, you're going to spend more time trying to fit the passage into the template than you are going to actually be analyzing it. So my advice to all my students is to follow a general order, to make sure you have a general structure. Introduction, body 1, body 2, body 3, conclusion, and know roughly what kind of arguments get made and what kind of devices get made so you can recognize them when you see them, but be flexible enough to take whatever comes your way and filter it through those very general understandings of how arguments get made, rather than filtering it through like, oh, I need to fit this into this sentence that I have already made up beforehand. But I want to reiterate again, I've seen students who start off barely being able to get one page done of an essay when they start out, and because they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, they read it and then they summarize it briefly, and they might summarize it very, very well, but they don't know what the SAT is looking for, and it's just not an acceptable, you can't give it a high score because it's just not acceptable for what the SAT is looking for. But with enough practice, enough exposure, enough articles read, enough pathos discovered, enough ethos discovered, enough logos discovered, you get better at talking about it, and you get better about putting your ideas down on paper. And I've seen students go from 10 to 24 within the space of not that long with enough exposure to these things. Another issue that I often run into with students is no matter how many times I tell them that they don't need to do this, they still feel like they need to show off in their writing, that they need to include fancy SAT words that they got rid of already, or they need to rephrase their sentence so that it sounds more complicated. And that's one of the first things I tell my students to throw out the window is write what seems natural to you. It may be bad, it may be able to be improved, but as you start writing, don't start out trying to trick the grader by using fancy words, and you're not going to get credit for something that you try to do fancy that doesn't work. It's like watching a figure skater or a gymnast or some other graded athletic performance where you can try to do the fanciest, most difficult trick, but if you don't land it, you're not going to get any points, and you're just going to have wasted the time that you could have used doing something that you can do well. So don't try to stick any weird, complicated landings that you're not super comfortable with. If you don't know, if it doesn't come naturally to you, don't force it. Those complicated words and sentence types are like very delicate and specific tools, and if you use them wrong, you break them and you end up injuring yourself. That's about everything that I've got for right now. I would go ahead and give it out to everybody for any questions and that they might have. I'd love to address specific questions that they might have. I'm not used to talking at length like this without having any feedback, so anything that you have any questions for, please fire away. I'm ready to answer any questions that you might have. Fundamentally, all rhetorical devices can be classified according to ethos, pathos, and logos. For example, if you talk about metaphor, you can say metaphor is a kind of logos. The author uses a metaphor to establish the emotional connection, like the sun was a fist in the sky. He establishes a physical metaphor to make the reader feel the power of the sun and be more likely to feel the way that he does. That's a pretty good example of how their ethos, pathos, and logos are tools, not guaranteed. They're ways to look at things, not a be-all, end-all solution. If you see the author uses many metaphors, he's using many metaphors in order to appeal to the pathos or to appeal to the logos of the reader. And so you don't actually need to talk about pathos and logos, but you need to understand why the author uses metaphors. Technically it doesn't, but there are basically no 24s that are shorter than 2 pages. It could be possible if you've got if you happen to be doing the paper one, if you've got really small handwriting, but in order to get all of your ideas out, you need full-length paragraphs, full-length everything, and you need to do it in the time allotted, and it's very, very difficult to get a full 24 if you don't have 2 pages worth of essay. No, it can be more, it could be less, but generally they follow something like it. It would be difficult to manage 2 large enough paragraphs that stayed on topic to cover the entirety of what's going on. And you'd have to have some rather complex ideas that you support well in order to do it. It's certainly possible, but the best ones that I've seen are 3 or 4 paragraphs in length for body. So you have 5, not counting the intro and conclusion. So 3 body paragraphs is kind of the magic number, but you could go higher, and I wouldn't recommend going lower. Yes, that's right. 2 raters each rate. So each rater grades from each category. So grader 1 gives a score on reading, analysis, and writing, and grader 2 gives a score on reading, analysis, and writing. And so you have a total of 6 different scores that you add together to get the final